Okay, so let's take a look at surveying a population. So when we're conducting a survey, it's really important that we choose the right questions to ask and that we choose the appropriate group to survey. So before any market research department designs a survey, the target group for the survey needs to be identified. So who are they trying to identify with the survey sample that they take? So let's start off by talking about a population. A population is all individuals or items, that belong to a group being studied. Now that might be the population of Canada if a study is curious about what Canadians think, or it might just be the people in a classroom. It might be the people in a school. It just what determines it is the actual study itself, what we're trying to figure out. Now a sample is a group of these individuals. I'll get back to that in a moment. Individuals. So often our population is far too big to survey every single person or every single individual within the group. It'd be, if you're looking to find out what Canadians think, then it's not very practical to go and ask every single Canadian in the country or out of the country. A more practical decision is to take a sample of this population, just ask that sample, and then you can make some assumptions based on what they say to predict what the others would have said. So a sample is a group of these individuals or items that, and this is the important part, are representative of the population. Of the given population. So you'll see what we mean by our representative in a moment. So when we're looking at how we add sampling techniques, what we're looking at really is how are we choosing this sample so that the individuals chosen are representative of a given population. So there are a few different methods to do so, a few different common methods. We're just going to go over some of the more popular ones here. So a simple random sample is when each member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. In this case, every single person has the same likelihood that they'll be selected to represent the total population. Now, with a stratified sample, it's a little bit different. First, you take a population. Let's say our population is Canadians. You take a population and you divide it into subgroups. So gender, age, or nationality, or location. And then you take a random sample from each of those subgroups in proportion to its size in the population. So in that case, you would be making sure that you had representatives of men and women. You'd be making sure you had representatives of youths and of the elderly, and you'd be making sure you had representatives of people from all over the country. And this takes more work in order to execute when compared to a simple random sample, but it definitely has its perks in that often it is more representative of the given population. Let's see here. A stratified random sample is when the population is divided into subgroups. example by gender, nationality, location. Really, it's any way that you can group your population together, and usually you're looking at a way in which your study might depend on. So, it's divided into subgroups and a random sample, just like, random. Just like above, is conducted on each subgroup. And a voluntary response sample, let's take a look down here now. A voluntary response sample is when the sample contains members of the population who have chosen to respond to a survey. So an example of this might be on the radio. Radio might say, call in if you feel strongly about a particular topic. And then the only people whose opinions the radio is collecting are those who have and a voluntary response sample, let's take a look down here now. A voluntary response sample is when the sample contains members of the population who have chosen to respond to a survey. So an example of this might be on the radio. Radio might say, call in if you feel strongly about a particular topic. And then the only people whose opinions the radio is collecting are those who have population whose views this radio station is collecting are those who have volunteered to do so. Usually the limits here are that the people who volunteer to do so are typically those who feel the strongest about the topic. So a voluntary response sample is a sample, it's made up of members who have volunteered to respond. And a convenience sample is fairly similar here. A convenience sample, it's a sample contained from those of a population where the data is most easily collected. So that might be the people who are walking by you while you're on the street. It might be the people whose information you already have. You might just choose to take that information for one reason or another. So the sample whose members of the population, whose members are of the population, are of the population that is most easily collected. There are a couple other common sampling techniques that I would like you to research on your own and submit to me in the Google Classroom. I'll make a discussion on it. Submit to me the definition for those sampling types. So those are, let me see here, you can choose to research and find a definition for a cluster sample, or for a systematic sample. Systematic sample. Now we'll move on into our questions about sampling, just to go over a little bit of our terminology here. Now a total of 100 students are surveyed. Oops, go back to my blue pen. A total of 100 students are surveyed, 20 from each grade, including the 5th year, from a school that has 1,250 students. So what is the population? Well, if we check, our population is all students that belong to a group being studied. That's right here. So all of the students that belong to the group would be given right here. That's 1,250 students. Now, what's our sample size? Our sample size is 100 students because those are the students that were sampled. Sample size 100. What percentage of the population is a sample size? Well, we've gone over percentages fairly frequently recently. Percentage of population would be 100. That's our sample size divided by, you know what, I'll write that out. It would be our sample size divided by our population size. Which equals 100 divided by 1,250, which if I bring that up on my calculator, that's 0.08, and I can turn that into a percentage by multiplying it by 100. We've been doing that fairly frequently, so that's 8%. Now, what kind of sampling technique is used here? Well, what they've done is they have taken 20 students from each grade, including the 5th year, in order to amass our 100 students. So what they've done, let's take a look, a simple random sample. It's not quite that, because they've done a little more work than just pulling randomly from these 1,250 students. A stratified sample is when the population is divided into subgroups. That kind of sounds like what we're doing here, into a subgroup for each grade. And a random sample is conducted on each subgroup. So that is what we're working with here. That's a stratified sample. Stratified sample. So you should familiarize yourself enough with these sampling techniques so that on a test, you know what, I'll include the homework ones, so that on a test you could recognize them and you would be able to tell me which sampling technique is used in a given scenario. Now let's take a look at biases. So bias is something that can affect your survey. When the survey results do not reflect the population, then we say there is bias. Now there could be a few different reasons for the survey results not reflecting the population. Some of the common ones are listed here again. So our sample selection bias. So sample selection bias. This affects our result when there was a mistake in choosing our sample. So sometimes that means that the sample we chose, basically, it means that the sample we chose is not indicative of our population. It might mean that the sample we have chosen is entirely made up of male respondents when there are more genders available within the Canadian population to choose from. It might be for any number of reasons, but in any case, it's when our sample does not reflect the population. And that is only one only one example of bias. Note that when we're talking about bias, we're saying the survey results don't reflect the population. Here we're saying when the sample does not reflect the population. Now, non-response bias is the bias that results from when respondents differ in meaningful ways from the non-respondents. And the non-respondents would be those members of a population that were not chosen for the sample. Now this is similar to sample selection bias, but often this can be caused by taking a convenient sample or a voluntary response sample, where maybe you're not choosing your own, or maybe you're not choosing the sample on your own, but either way, those the respondents that have chosen themselves to show up to be a part of your survey, they're still not indicative of the population. Now, a loaded question is a scenario where within the survey you're asking a question that kind of forces a responder to respond in a certain way, to answer in a certain way. So you'll put question and the questions push a certain response from the recipient. An example of this might be have you stopped littering? An example, the reason this is a good example of a loaded question is because if someone comes up to you and they ask you that question, by answering, you're almost assuming, you're taking on the assumption that you have littered in the past and that you had a habit of littering in the past. So that's an example of a question that kind of is assumptive in itself, and you know what, I'll leave that there. And it's often a little bit indicative of maybe some mixed motivations behind those who are building a sample. What kind of bias is demonstrated in each of these scenarios? So first, we have a poll conducted to ask students if they think the school should do more to help the environment. Any students participating in the poll should drop off their survey at the front office. After the results are tallied, 92% of students are in favor of the school doing more to help the environment. Well, on the surface, that sounds great. 92% of the students are in favor of the school doing more. Now, we don't have any information on the actual questions involved in this survey, so we can't say they're loaded questions, even though the conclusion maybe sounds a little bit loaded. What I might suggest here is what we have. Let's first take a look at what kind of sampling we have. Well, it looks like we have some voluntary response sampling. So the sample is made up of members who have volunteered to respond. We know that because the students participating choose to drop off their survey at the front office. So, and often when we have voluntary response sample, and the kind of bias we have is non-response bias, because those who are not feeling as strongly probably aren't walking down to the front office to respond to the sample. So non-response bias. And example B here, a newspaper poll reads, do you favor the proposed bylaw in which the government will dictate whether you have the right to smoke in a restaurant? Now this question in itself, it is a loaded question. The way we can find that out is because the way we can identify it is because the question kind of contains some extra information that doesn't necessarily have to be there. If the question ended with, do you favor the say new proposed bylaw, and the question ended there, then that takes the load out of the question. But the question doesn't end there. It includes kind of some forceful wording here. Will dictate. That sounds quite aggressive. Whether you have the right, so they're taking away your rights to smoke in a restaurant. So this here is an example of a loaded question. And finally, the SAA asks spectators at a basketball game if the school should spend money on new uniforms. Well, here what we're looking at is sample selection bias, and I'm not surprised by that. So when our sample does not reflect the population. In this case, so I'll just write that down, sample selection bias. In this case, we can identify it here because here we're asking if the school should spend money. So really, the people who are affected by that are the school's population. But the only people we're asking are the spectators at a basketball game, the sample right here. And the question we're asking about is whether the basketball team needs new uniforms. So it's completely connected to this chosen sample. It's really not a fair representation of how the school feels. So that should give you a nice rundown on the different ways that we look at how samples are put together.